Pokemon Legends Arceus is one of the best Pokemon games out there. It brought in a whole new element of gameplay and a whole new historical timeline in which we could explore, letting us go into a much wider version of the Sinnoh region than we ever thought possible. And when its sequel, sort of, was announced in Pokemon Legends ZA back in February, the internet lost its mind, or at least the Pokemon community side of it. Some other people who never heard of Pokemon probably didn't care. But it's a whole new game that's coming out into the Kalos region, bringing back one of the most popular mechanisms that has been thought of and introduced into the Pokemon games of Mega Evolution. But since then, we haven't really heard anything about what's going to be coming in Pokemon Legends ZA. We thought we might have got something in November. It passed and nothing happened, so likely we're not going to hear anything officially until February, when we have the Pokemon Day. But that's a bit too long to wait. I've got some thoughts and theories of what might be coming along in Pokemon Legends ZA. Now, this is going to be mixed in with some official information that we got from the trailer, and I am aware that there were leaks that happened in the last couple of months. I didn't read those. I have no idea what is contained in those, so these are just going to be my own thoughts, opinions, and theories of what might be coming up, and a few things that I hope they keep from Legends ZA, and a few things that I hope they get rid of. I guess normally in these sorts of things people would say spoiler potential, but I don't know any of these things yet. So I guess I'm going to split these up into story and mechanisms, I guess. So if you want to skip through the story section and go on to the mechanisms, by all means. But before you do, subscribe if you haven't already. So the story. We already know that we're going to be spending the entirety of the game in Lumio City in the Kalos region. And it's part of this big civic redevelopment program, which is kind of interesting. We'll see what becomes of that. But there's a timeline issue that we potentially need to get ironed out. You see, Legends Arceus took us back to the Hisui region, which is the Sinnoh of old, and then tied it in nicely with our previous generations. But Kalos doesn't have the same lore in terms of the timeline of a recent path that Sinnoh did. So I'm not entirely certain what we're going to find ourselves in. I have two competing theories as to what sort of timeline we're going to find ourselves in. Either we're going to be about 10, 15 years into the future, as far along into the future forward from X and Y as we are now in the real world. Or we're going way back to when Lumio City was just a set of blueprints, which I think is the more likely version, if only because it would make sense to begin this city anew. If we go down these two different timelines though, there's going to be some interesting thoughts around this goes. If we go back into the time, like we did with Hisui, then we're going along the full development and city planning aspect, which is kind of interesting. But it also means we're going to be doing a lot of Pokemon displacement, which is not ideal. The animals of this world don't necessarily like it when we move them out of their homes, so that could be a problem. But if we're doing this in more modern times, then things get a little more interesting. Both of these timelines will have potential issues of how new Pokemon could be introduced, which is something that they did in Legends Arceus. They brought in these new Hisui forms for the 3 starters, and they brought in some Hisui forms of other Pokemon and their evolutions. But at least these Pokemon existing had a reason to make sense in the lore, because the Hisui of 200 years ago was the Sinnoh of a couple hundred years ago, but things changed when it became Sinnoh in the preceding years. But if we're sticking to modern day, Kalos won't have changed that much, apart from the events of the life canon that have been done with Team Flare. Perhaps evolution might not have changed so much to give the Pokemon a bit of a variance. However, it could reasonably be that Pokemon in the past had those different evolutions. We've certainly seen variances in Pokemon in more recent times with the Paradox Pokemon that have been dragged forward in time. So it's not beyond the wit of man to see that sort of evolution. Over a couple of hundred years, sure, evolution can happen. But 10 years probably isn't enough to see that sort of a change. So I don't think it's likely, if that's the storyline they're going for, we're going to see that many new Pokemon. Because we had all the Pokemon up to Gen 6 were already available in Kalos. Not necessarily directly, but they could have been traded back and forth with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, etc, etc. So what could happen, we could have variants of Gens 7 onwards, or we find new Megastones. Mega Evolution has already been confirmed as returning, so why are there now new Mega Evolutions? Part of my theory of this is that as we're breaking ground across the city, we find underneath Lumio City a whole cache of new Megastones, which means we will have that whole ore available to us to Mega Evolve Pokemon that could never Mega Evolve before. There's a lot of confusion as to why Pokemon such as Mewtwo were able to get a Mega Evolution, given that it's a technically synthetic Pokemon because it was a clone of Mew. And Mew never got a Mega Evolution, so maybe Mew was supposed to have those and they just didn't line up. I don't really know how this is going to work out. I do think, though, that the hulking giant of AZ, whatever his name actually is supposed to be pronounced as, he is going to be involved in some way, as is Zygarde, the legendary Pokemon of Carlos, that never really got a chance to shine because we never had a Pokemon Z. Those two characters are probably going to pop up quite a bit and make a real impact into the story. And in fact, it could be that Zygarde, as the protector of nature, is going to have a problem with the humans redeveloping the city. If we're going along the redevelopment city, we've already seen on the big map that there are 5 circular plazas, almost, but they could be biomes, much like we have in the Blueberry Academy of Unova. If we have got those different biomes, then each of those will probably correlate to a Pokemon type or habitat that is found off of the routes of Lumiose City in the current X and Y games. So if you go off Route 14, for example, there is a swamp to the north. If you go to the southwest, you get grassland on Route 4. If you go to the east, you have the cliffs and a famous fishing spot. To the west, you have the desert. And then to the southeast, you have a skate park, which, yeah, okay, that one doesn't necessarily line up very well. But that could be a potential. We find those biomes being absorbed into the city, and those plazas are created to help you capture as many different Pokemon as you can. One thing that perhaps needs to be considered is that the Carlos region is vast. There are so many Pokemon available there. The Pokedex is split into 3 different regions, the mountain, the coastal, and the central, which is about 453, 54 Pokemon. That's a lot to try and cram into a much more condensed area, which means if we're going into the modern day theory, that means all those Pokemon are being transported into the city, or are rampaging against why the city is being redeveloped. I'm not sure how this is necessarily going to be handled, and I'm not sure how much scope there is for newer Pokemon to be brought in. I feel like most of the evolutions we're going to be seeing are Mega Evolutions. Personally, I hope we're going with the previous generation. I feel like if we're going into the Carlos of now, I'd rather develop the story of the history a little bit. Legends Arceus had a lot of great story moments which were developing the lore that we already had and filling in some of those question marks, like why do we have in Eterna City that statue that could be both Palkia and Dialga? Well, it's because the people of Sinnoh, or Hisui at the time, used to believe that they were one and the same. There was one deity of Sinnoh until we found that there were 2 different ones. I would be interested to see what happened there. There's all sorts of stories that happened. See, Carlos had the war 3,000 years earlier, and then about 800 years before the current events of the story, Xerneas and Yveltal absorbed the life of the energy of the big weapon. I'm still not entirely certain how all that happened, to be perfectly honest. It's been a while since I played those games. And made a real impact into what's going on as it sank below Geosenge Town. So something a little bit further back in time would be more interesting to me, but we'll see what happens. I'm still really looking forward to seeing what happens in this game. So in terms of the mechanisms that I hope come into play, I really hope we do a lot more of that Pokemon study and exploration thing that we did in Legends Arceus. That was a really interesting way of changing up the formula enough so that we could go and find out about these Pokemon. We could observe them doing their different habitats. It was a little bit like bringing in Pokemon Snap and taking time to study the Pokemon, see what they were doing, and focus on exactly how they would behave in the hours. It was almost like a wildlife survey, which in the world of Pokemon is much more interesting because those cats and dogs that you see running around, they can throw lightning at you, and that's terrifying. But one thing I hope they get rid of from ZA is the battle system. I didn't really like the way that the Hisui battle style shifted. So in Legends Arceus we had that basically turn RPG kind of thing, so you could adjust it with strong and agile style of moves, and I didn't necessarily enjoy that. I prefer the rigidity of calculating how speed is put out in the normal turn-based games. In the mainline games, it makes a lot more sense for me. It's just easier for me to keep track of, and I found that a little frustrating, particularly when you had multi-battles where you had 3 against 1. If you had 3 turns all against you because you couldn't hit fast enough or hard enough, it kind of threw me off, so I didn't really enjoy it. But I do like the shiny hunting methods that came with Legends Arceus, in that you had that nice noise that came up whenever you were running around and a shiny occurred. You can go, Where is it? Hopefully that will make a return. I also kind of hope that the crafting doesn't return. Now, it depends on when the story is being set. If it is being set in the modern day era, crafting doesn't need to exist. You can just buy the stuff from the Pokeballs. Carlos has a Pokeball factory right there. You don't need to spend your time crafting these Pokeballs. I can understand it a little bit more if we're going back in time. The factory won't necessarily exist. It's a new technology. It's a little bit more inventiveness that needs to be done in order to survive. But I didn't feel like I needed to have that extra level of complexity to get the items that I wanted. Yeah, that's not what I play Pokemon for, is to figure out how to make these different things. I'd rather just do the Pokemon stuff. And the last thing that I would like to see carry over is the introduction of characters that we are already familiar with, or at least ancestry or connected characters in some way or other. So we had all of the different characters that popped up that were clearly ancestors of Pokemon trainers and significant characters that we meet, as well as one random guy from Unova who just turned up and he was just like, huh, okay then, Ingo's here. Alright, we could have that element put in place. If we are going with the modern day storyline, then yeah, it makes sense to, we're 10 years down the line, some of these trainers will have grown up. We may have found that Bonnie is now the gym leader and has taken over for her brother, who is now busy building stuff. We'll have the professor is now running around doing his fun little study into Mega Evolution because we have all these new Mega Stones to deal with. I'm really looking forward to it and seeing what Legends ZA is going to become. I really hope that it captures the magic the same way that Legends Arceus does and doesn't become less fun as a result. In Legends Arceus, we have the entirety of the Sinnoh and Hisui region, whichever you prefer to call it, as our plaything. We can go around and explore all these different nooks and crannies that weren't necessarily there in the 2D games. But going from that and then shrinking it down into admittedly one of the largest cities in the entirety of the Pokemon franchise, I'm not sure that that's necessarily an upgrade. It feels like we've then gone down a step and we've sort of constrained ourselves in an unnecessary way. I appreciate we weren't able to see the pure majesty of Carlos and the entirety of this fantastical city, the Neo City, in the original games because the 3DS didn't have the capability to run that. Maybe we'll see a little bit more of that, I don't know. I'm hopeful that we can see a lot more of the city with a lot more detail. Now, one last thing that does need to be ironed out is my thoughts on what's going to be happening in terms of starters. In Carlos, we had two different groups of starters available to us. We had the original Cantonian starters of Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle, and then we had the three Carlosian starters in Chespin, Fennekin, and Froakie. It's unlikely that we're going to see new starters because we already have 3 in place. In fact, we have 6 in place technically for this region. It's possible that we'll see Pokemon come from different regions, and I'd love to see the continuation of the theme from Legends Arceus, bringing in a trio of Pokemon made up from different generations. So you could get yourself, I don't know, Chikorita, Tepig, and Poplio, for example. You could have that combination as the 3 least favoured starters of their generations to complement the 3 most populars of the Hisui region. Or you can go down the middle. We can have Totodile, Litten, and Snivy. So that each of those generations in a Legends game is getting their own look in. And then maybe we still have Mega Evolutions available for the Gen 6 starters, because they probably should have had it. Those are my thoughts and theories of what's going to be happening in Pokemon Legends ZA. Let me know down in the comments what you think of those theories and what you think is going to happen in the game. I really look forward to reading those. And as I say, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you again soon. Bye, everyone.